Scene 7, the headmaster's address. As the lights dimmed, a soft hush fell over the crowd, conversations dying to murmurs before fading altogether. Tira felt Max's presence clear and steady, his silence a calm that contrasted with the hushed excitement around her. She let her eyes drift to the stage, her heartbeat steadying as a spotlight illuminated a tall, older man in deep purple robes, whose face held an air of scholarly severity. Headmaster Aubergine stepped forward, his hands clasped before him in a gesture that commanded the room's attention. "Welcome, students," his voice carried across the room, strong and measured as though it were amplified by magic. "Welcome to Manaheim Academy. It is here that generations of young minds have come to pursue the arcane, to forge knowledge and strength, to confront challenges, both of the world and of the self." He paused, letting his words settle, and Tira could sense his pride. For a moment she felt a pang of excitement, the weight of the Academy's history making the air feel charged. Addie leaned over, whispering, "Not exactly the thrill of a lifetime, eh?" Her tone was light-hearted, but the jab was clear. Tira stifled a laugh, shooting her a look of amused warning. From Tira's left, Kenny shot a frown in Addie's direction, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Show some respect," he muttered, barely loud enough for Tira to catch. His reaction wasn't missed by Tira, who noticed his frustration was more than just a mild annoyance. Golden Eagles versus Azure Bears, she thought, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she sensed the clash of their natures. Headmaster Aubergine continued, unfazed by the crowd's subtle murmurs. "Manaheim was founded on principles as unyielding as the foundations of this building, though admittedly with more sturdy craftsmanship, it would seem." The headmaster's gaze flicked over the room, a glimmer of humor flashing in his eyes before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Tira straightened, suddenly feeling the auditorium's imperfections with new awareness. It was as though the building's ancient wood and worn seats whispered its history, carrying secrets she couldn't yet know. Headmaster Aubergine gestured to his right, where the woman in robes of deep squash and zucchini, who had ushered them into the auditorium, stepped forward. Her presence was commanding, her expression stern, and even before she spoke, Tira felt the atmosphere sharpen around her. "Madame Courgette will now introduce our house professors and provide the necessary instructions for your examination," he announced, his tone softening only slightly in the woman's presence. He stepped back, giving her the floor. Madame Courgette inclined her head, her gaze scanning the room as though sizing up each student individually. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was squeaky with age, yet as firm as her posture. "Before you embark on your first test at Manaheim, it is imperative you understand the values our four houses embody. Each house is represented by its professor, whose leadership upholds the house's standards and guides its students." With a sweep of her hand she gestured to the edge of the stage where the first professor, a tall, broad-shouldered man clad in cobalt blue and silver, stepped forward. His presence was imposing, his jaw set with a discipline that seemed to radiate from every angle of his form. He nodded solemnly to the students, a subtle but unmistakable mark of respect for the next generation. "This is Professor Slater, head of Azure Bears," Madame Courgette announced. "Professor Slater is a former Templar knight, known for his valor and unyielding dedication to order." Her gaze shifted over the crowd, and Tira noticed the small approving nods among some students. She couldn't shake the faint distaste that rose in her, the sight of Professor Slater stirring memories of her father, before her days at the orphanage. She could see the look of pride in Kenny's face as he observed the stoic, formidable professor. His presence seemed to reflect the more rigid side of the Azure Bears, the same emphasis on loyalty, tradition, and authority that her father had tried to instill in her. But for Tira, those years had taught her to be silent. She held her breath, pushing away the memories that rose to the surface. The applause was measured but respectful, fading as a woman in flowing crimson robes and laden with jewelry stepped forward next. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, and her posture exuded a kind of regal severity. "Professor Roslin," Madame Courgette continued, her tone neutral, "head of the Crimson Tigers. Professor Roslin's tenure is marked by her keen intelligence and her unyielding pursuit of excellence. She does not tolerate failure. There was an undertone of warning in her words that left an uneasy ripple across the crowd, as though failure itself might be punished by Professor Roslin personally. For a moment Tira felt her pulse quicken, a curiosity sparking within her. There was something about Professor Roslin that reminded her of the abilities she kept hidden, the dark arts she'd dabbled in, secrets she'd unearthed alone, like the wilted flower in her hand when she'd been overwhelmed with anger, feeling the life seep from it and pulse into her own veins. Max's presence had always been a comfort, a constant reminder of her own power's potential. But could someone like Roslyn help her harness it, or maybe help her understand what her connection to Max truly meant? Max's voice brushed against her mind, faint but warm, as though sensing her thoughts. "Be cautious, Tira," he murmured, but there was a hint of intrigue there too. The allure of Roslyn's unyielding focus resonated with Tira, even if it left her unsettled. The applause for Professor Roslin was more subdued, though tinged with a mix of admiration and apprehension. Next, Madame Courgette gestured to a man whose pearly smile seemed to radiate effortless charm even before he moved. Professor Flavio stepped forward with an easy grace, his golden robes catching the light as though woven with threads of sunlight. He was undeniably striking, and Tira found herself momentarily captivated, her heart skipping a beat. Something about him reminded her of Elizabeth, the confident, magnetic presence that seemed to draw people in effortlessly. "Professor Flavio, head of Golden Eagles," Madame Courgette said, a faint crack of irritation in her voice. "His leadership embodies freedom and creativity, though he has yet to prove that his methods will produce as much discipline as they do enthusiasm." Laughter and applause erupted from pockets of the auditorium, louder than before, as though the students themselves couldn't help but respond to Professor Flavio's charisma. Even Addie, Mac, and Tommy rose to their feet. Tira felt her resolve waver slightly. She could see why so many were drawn to him, and a faint tug in her chest hinted at her own intrigue. But as she glanced back toward Elizabeth, the same allure yet unease settled in her stomach. Lastly, a young woman with unusual, almost otherworldly features stepped forward, her robes in hues of emerald and silver. Her pointed ears and slightly alien structure gave her an exotic beauty, and she looked more like a student than a professor. "Professor Myrtle, head of Verdant Deer," Madame Courgette announced. Professor Myrtle is known for her empathy and her deep connection to the natural world, embodying the ideals of harmony and resilience. Her words were softer now, and Tira sensed a deep respect under the surface. As Tira observed her, she caught a detail she hadn't noticed at first: Professor Myrtle's eyes, a striking shade of amber orange. Possibly the exact color Tira herself had in one eye, a trait her mother had shared. Her pulse quickened with a sense of wonder, as though Professor Myrtle's presence held a key to the mysteries of her mother's heritage. She was taken aback, feeling the connection in her gut, a curiosity blossoming that went beyond house allegiances or rivalry. For the first time she felt a desire to learn more about her own roots, the secrets her mother had left behind. The applause was gentle, almost reverent, a reflection of the verdant deer's calm, nurturing presence. As the last applause faded, Madame Courgette's gaze sharpened. "Now to the matter of your examination." Her voice cut through the lingering whispers, bringing a renewed focus to the room. "You will enter the examination area in groups of 10 through a portal on the stage." She gestured to a dormant archway behind her that Tira hadn't noticed prior. "Each group will be evaluated based on individual performance, teamwork, and adaptability under unknown conditions." Tira felt a surge of anticipation ripple through her, a quiet thrill at the thought of stepping into the unknown. "You will not be given answers to your questions that arise," Madame Courgette continued. "In fact, part of your task will be to navigate the unfamiliar without guidance. Consider it a test of both intellect and instinct." Her gaze swept over the rows of students, lingering as though searching for those who were truly listening. "Trust the process," she intoned with quiet, reverberating strength, "and remember that true knowledge is earned, not given." A ripple of silence settled over the crowd, a weight of unspoken words and lingering doubts. Tira felt a sense of resolve harden within her, a quiet determination that balanced her unease. Whatever awaited them, she would face it. As the applause dimmed and the lights rose, students began murmuring to each other, the weight of the instructions settling in. Bannock leaned toward Tira and Addie, his usual cheer dampened slightly, but his eyes bright with anticipation. "So, that was a lot," Bannock said with a grin, his voice pitched low. "You both ready for this?" His question carried both eagerness and a hint of vulnerability, a quiet reminder that the unknown loomed just as large for him. Addie shrugged, rolling her eyes with mock bravado. "Exciting enough for me. I'd much rather tackle a challenge than take a boring test." Tira took a breath, allowing Max's presence to settle her. "Just trying to embrace the uncertainty," she replied softly, glancing at the portal ahead. "You'll find you're more ready than you think," Max murmured, his voice warm and clear now. Bannock chuckled, catching Tira's look, and offered a small reassuring nod. "Together, then, whatever happens next."